your host, Senior Legal Counsel of the Justice Collaborative. And today we're going to be talking about a heavy topic. We're also going to be uplifting Breonna Taylor. So the topic today is no-knock warrants and military-style police raids, a topic that has garnered national attention after Louisville police officers shot and killed 26-year-old emergency medical technician Breonna Taylor. The world knows the name of George Floyd. The world should also know Breonna Taylor. So we're going to lift her up today and talk about both what happened and also what we could do to change the reality on the ground. Officers arrived at Breonna Taylor's home on March 13th, around 1 a.m., to execute a no-knock warrant for a person who did not live there and who had been arrested earlier that day. Police argue they both knocked and announced their presence. Neighbors and Breonna's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, say they did not hear any identification. Instead, Kenneth and Breonna believed an intruder was trying to break into their apartment. As officers breached the door, Kenneth fired a warning shot, which hit an officer in the leg. In response, officers fired more than 20 rounds. At least 8 of them hit Breonna, killing her. Kenneth was charged with attempted murder. The case was later dropped 10 weeks later. I listened to the 911 call, and it's horrifying to think about what that must have felt like for Kenneth and the tragedy for Breonna and her family. It took months for Breonna's case to gain national attention. And now, amid the outrage and confusion, people in this country are asking themselves, like, how did something like this happen? And what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again? Our guests today are going to help us find answers to both of those questions. We are joined today by Louisville Metro Council President David A. James. Hey, David. Metro Council member and chairperson of its Public Safety Committee, Jessica Green. Metro Council member and Public Safety Committee member, Barbara Sexton Smith, and journalist and policing expert, Radley Balco. Radley, I'd like to start with you. Given your extensive research on this subject, I'd like to start with, educating our audience and making sure they have a fuller understanding of what exactly we're talking about here. So you've studied this issue for quite some time. Can you give us a little bit of a better understanding of what a no-knock warrant is and how it differs from a regular warrant, including its execution?
Sure. So I just had a piece go up at the Washington Post yesterday on Breonna Taylor's case. And so I'm just going to start by saying that the warrant for her home was illegal. And any Fourth Amendment scholar will back me up on this, and I'm going to explain why. So when police serve a warrant, they're bound by what's called the knock and announce rule. And this requires them to knock, announce themselves, and give wait long enough to give the people inside the home time to answer the door and let the police in peacefully. And this has a long tradition going back to English common law of a principle called the Castle Doctrine, which states that the home should be a place of peace and sanctuary, and the government should only violate that peace and sanctuary under the most extreme of circumstances. So most of the time when the police serve a warrant, they have to knock and announce themselves and give the people in time to come to the door. If they can present what are called exigent circumstances, a court can authorize a no-knock entry into the house. Those exigent circumstances are if the suspect presents a threat to dispose of evidence before the police can get in, if the suspect presents a threat to attack the police officers, or if there's reason to believe the suspect might flee. The Supreme Court laid down these rules in a case called Wilson versus Arkansas in the 1990s. What happened was police departments responded by basically claiming that all drug suspects meet these exigent circumstances, and so therefore every drug case should be served with a no-knock warrant. The Supreme Court responded with another decision in Richard versus Wisconsin, where they said, no, that you can't do that. You can't have a blanket exception saying all drug cases are exigent circumstances just by their very nature. You have to give particular specific evidence why this particular suspect is a threat to dispose of evidence, flee, or attack the police, right? So
was there that evidence in this case, specific evidence?
No, so this is why the raid in this case was illegal. The police obtained a no-knock warrant in this case, and the warrant for Breonna Taylor's house, they used the exact same word-for-word language that they used in all the other 4 warrants in this same investigation. Now, I would argue that there was not enough evidence for a no-knock warrant for any of these suspects. even the people they're investigating, their only prior crimes were drug crimes or a firearms crime. There was no evidence that they had ever committed violence against another person. There was no evidence that they had attacked police officers. But Breonna Taylor's warrant was particularly problematic because her only connection to this, she had no prior criminal history, save for a shoplifting charge that was later dismissed. Her only connection to this was that the main suspect had received a couple of packages at her house, which turned out to be shoes and clothing. The problem is that the Supreme Court, in another case called Hudson versus Michigan, ruled that when it comes to no-knock raids, even if police conduct the no-knock raid illegally, even if they violate all these rules that we set down, we're not going to apply the exclusionary rule. We're not going to tell them that any evidence that they seize can't be used against the defendant. And what Hudson did, I'm sorry?
Why is that important that the exclusionary rule doesn't apply?
Because it basically says, the Supreme Court has said, we have this rule that's grounded in all the centuries of common law and the Castle Doctrine, but we're not going to enforce it. And so what we've seen since that Hudson case in 2006 is police departments across the country violate the knock and announce rule with wild abandon. Judges sign these warrants, like in this case, that are clearly illegal. And they get away with it because there's no enforcement mechanism for this rule. A year and a half ago, I reviewed over 100 warrants in Little Rock, Arkansas, and found that in 98 of the 103 warrants I looked at, the police had used the exact same identical word-for-word language in explaining why they needed a no-knock warrant. And in every single case, the judge granted it to them. And when I called the judges in Little Rock and asked them, why did you sign these illegal warrants? They didn't even know they were illegal. This is not sort of my opinion about what the law is. There's no question. If you read Richards versus Wisconsin, the Supreme Court is explicitly clear. You cannot have a blanket rule that says all drug dealers meet one of these exigent circumstances. You have to have specific evidence to get a no-knock warrant. And yet, the cops don't care. The judges don't care. And there's a reason for this, right? We know that when you break into somebody's home in the middle of the night, you instill in them a very sort of primitive response, right? It's your home is being attacked. And to be honest, if you are innocent, if the police did get the wrong home, you're even less likely to think that the people breaking down your door are cops because you haven't done anything wrong. And you're more likely to try to defend yourself. We have to start holding cops accountable for breaking these rules. And frankly, we have to start holding judges accountable for just rubber stamping these warrants without giving them any scrutiny.
Definitely. Now we've seen since 2010 more than, I believe, 100 civilians have been killed during no-knock raids. Many more have been injured and traumatized. From your perspective, like, what have you seen a shift in cities and states trying to figure out how to solve this problem? Like, what have you seen, expanding from Louisville?
Right. Some are and some aren't. We have seen there have been places that have, usually after a huge case like this makes national news, we've seen some reforms. I know New York City no longer uses flash grenades during these raids because they raided the wrong house and killed a 58-year-old woman who was innocent.
What is a flash grenade?
Flash grenade is called a flashbang grenade. It's a device, a distractionary device. It just explodes with this blinding light and a loud explosion. And the idea is it's supposed to sort of distract people. It's not, it doesn't blow up like a grenade, and take out a whole room, but it does. I mean, people have died from flash grenades. They're supposed to be non-lethal. But what we have seen is where we've seen reforms are generally in places where a big case like this has blown up and has sort of forced the police's hand. A lot of times they go back to the way things were after a few years. In Maryland, we saw some good reforms on SWAT teams after the police mistakenly raided the mayor of a small town and killed his dogs. That was another case where the police alleged that a drug trafficker had received packages at an address and raided that address just based on that. Getting back to Louisville, though, in my piece yesterday, I found there was a 2015 study by a criminologist who accompanied Louisville raid teams on over 70 raids over, I believe, a 1-year period, or maybe it was a 2-year period. And what he found was that in the vast majority of cases, they did not get a no-knock warrant. They got a knock and announce warrant. But when he observed the raids, the overwhelming majority of time, the police would knock and announce themselves as the battering ram was hitting the door. They did not wait and give people time to come to the door. Well, from the perspective of the people inside, and I would argue legally, that's no different than a no-knock raid. If you don't give people a chance to avoid violence to their person and the destruction of the property, that is a no-knock raid. And just one more thing, the one really sort of just mind-blowing part of that study was he found that when the police thought that the person that they were about to raid was actually dangerous, was actually a threat, and not just a low-level drug offender who they could sort of bully and boss around, they did announce themselves. And in fact, at one point, a lieutenant was told his team before the raid, "This guy is dangerous. Let's make sure we announce ourselves this time." That is astounding to me, right? Because that tells you that, one, these tactics aren't necessary. And when they actually are afraid of somebody who may shoot back at them, they actually observe the knock and announce requirement because they know that taking advantage of somebody, surprising them, confusing them deliberately is dangerous. It's dangerous not just for the people inside; it's also dangerous for the police officers.
Yeah, thank you, Radley, for breaking that down and for all of your work on this subject, and your research, and just all of your contributions in enabling us to understand both what's happening and what we need to see happen. I'd like to bring in Councilmember Green. Thank you for joining us. I know you guys are under, I think you're muted. I know you're under intense pressure from the community. I know you guys have been lifting up Breonna too and trying to figure out how to solve this. So thank you. On May 19th, the mayor announced some initial changes to police policies, specifically that body cameras would be available to all sworn officers in situations where they have to announce themselves, and that no-knock warrants will now require sign-on from LMPD chief before getting a judge's approval. Now, you had a powerful response to these changes. You stated, quote, "My expectation is that there will be policy change, there will be action, that there will be a better relationship between African Americans and police officers, and that Black people will stop being gunned down." Tell us a bit about what you were thinking, and what did you mean by that statement?
Well, typically in government, there is a knee-jerk reaction when something occurs. And so I think that it was a good thing for the mayor to temporarily suspend the police department's policy on no-knock warrants, but he's also already publicly stated that he doesn't know what his position is going to be on Breonna's law. And so that hits me in the gut, and it tells me more than anything that some of these knee-jerk reactions are just pandering to people. You pander and you say something, we are going to suspend a policy, but when it comes time to codify it into law so that no matter whose administration is in power, then at times we have people back off or they are lukewarm. And so I would say that the time for pandering has passed, and we've got to codify some of the policies that we see in a knee-jerk way so that we know that in the years to come, people will feel safe. Officers, I believe, will be safer with some of the policies that we have proposed. And so that's exactly what we're hoping to do right now.
So, we're going to talk about how we get past the pandering and into real policy change. Before we get to that, at one point you mentioned that you believe Kenneth Walker is a hero, and you got some blowback for that statement. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and why you refused to apologize?
Yeah, we had a public safety committee meeting about 2 weeks ago, and we had the attorneys for Breonna Taylor's family was there. And as part of that discussion, and as the meeting wrapped up, I indicated that I did not believe that Kenneth Walker should be incarcerated, and that I believe that he was a hero for defending his household, defending his significant other. There was some blowback from the FOP in the days that came from that, who they were not happy with my statement. But the reality of the fact is that I said that statement 2 weeks ago on a Wednesday. By I believe that Friday, Kenneth Walker's charges were being dismissed. And so I would assure anybody and everybody, I don't have the power to make anybody dismiss charges if there really was a situation where somebody feels like that somebody was an attempted cop killer. I've been a prosecutor. I've told people over and over that charges against people who attempt to shoot cops or try to or shoot cops are not dismissed, but for an egregious indication and acknowledgement that the evidence is completely insufficient. And so I don't believe that those charges would have been dismissed, but for the prosecutors reviewing the evidence in the case and them finding sufficient amount of evidence to show that Kenneth Walker actually was not guilty under the law of the offense that he was indicted with. And so I stand by what I said. I believe that the law and what has happened subsequent to that statement has really bolstered that position. And so, we're at a point now where we try to figure out how we put the pieces back together again.
Okay, let's talk about how we put the pieces back together. And by the way, thank you for speaking your truth. You mentioned FOP blowback. For our viewers who may not be familiar, what's the FOP? Just briefly.
Fraternal Order of the local FOP that represents our Louisville Metro Police Department. And the night that I made my statement, they called a press conference the following day, essentially to denounce my comments and I guess talk about how disrespectful I was. I had the opportunity to sit down with the FOP the morning after that for us to try to come to some understanding of what I was saying, and that I was in no way endorsing the idea of shooting or killing cops. I would never do that. People locally hear me say all the time, I've got an 11-year-old son who wants to be an LMPD detective, and he's a Black kid growing up in the hood. So we talk about law enforcement in a positive way. So we sat down, we had a conversation. They did choose to proceed with that press conference that day after our conversation, where they essentially denounced my actions, my comments.
Thank you for clarifying that. So the Metro Council's Public Safety Committee voted to name the pending no-knock legislation Breonna's Law. Can you talk about what the bill entails and how it would have prevented Breonna Taylor's death?
Okay. Well, let me first say at the offset that I am completely against the idea of no-knock warrants in their entirety. I believe that the police's ability to enter premises with the imminent threat exception would suffice. And so warrants themselves are all about retrieval of evidence. I don't believe that there's ever a situation that justifies putting officer lives or civilian lives at risk or potential death for the retrieval of evidence. With that being said, the art of legislation and trying to work together has led us to the piece of legislation that we have right now. I'm very proud of Breonna's Law. And so what it essentially does, it restricts the ability to utilize no-knock warrants, except in cases where there are exigent circumstances. And so those circumstances would be danger to civilians. So in cases like sexual trafficking, they would be in cases of terrorism. So what we would think of as extreme cases. It's been a little frustrating because I've asked multiple times, can anybody tell me the types of cases, or is there a record of the kind of cases where no-knock warrants have been utilized in Louisville over the past few years? Unfortunately, they don't keep those kinds of records. So it's very frustrating for me to be able to even understand if there have been exigent circumstances that have necessitated these warrants in the past in Louisville. I can assure you, and I can say clearly, that if Breonna Taylor and Kenneth Walker's example is any indication of the kind of cases that no-knock warrants have been utilized in, then I think that it's a complete and absolute shame. But the proposal would drastically restrict the ability to utilize no-knock warrants. There would also be a requirement that officers would have their body cams on during the execution of all warrants, even in cases where it's a regular type of warrant, because I think that that information is extremely relevant to be able to determine what actually occurred. We don't have any body cam videos from the night of Ms. Taylor's death. There was also another death in Louisville in the last week or so, David McAtee, and it's another case where there's an officer involved shooting where there's actually no body cam video. And so it leads people to be extremely frustrated and enraged. So again, those are the big things that the ordinance does. Restricts the types of cases in which no-knocks can be utilized, and a requirement that the officers have to have on body cams. There's also a portion in there that requires a reporting mechanism on a quarterly basis, that the officers would be required to report the types of cases that are utilized. We added some strengthening language there yesterday that will require them to determine the location and potential races of the individuals. And so I believe that all of that is relevant as we track these types of warrants and to be able to determine the efficacy and whether or not we should actually keep them and Louisville.
Thanks so much. Councilmember Barbara Sexton Smith, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. You previously signaled support to completely banning no-knock warrants, but ultimately the bill is a little different. So why, can you explain why the shift and some of the realities you're dealing with, Barbara? Did we lose Barbara? Okay, I think we lost Barbara.
I think she's on mute.
Okay. Can we unmute Barbara? Okay, we got you.
Am I unmuted now?
We got you.
Okay. All right. My colleagues like to mute me as well in chambers, so I'm used to that. So thank you very much for inviting us to be here. And yes, as soon as I learned of the tragic killing of Breonna Taylor, and we must say her name, Breonna Taylor, because that is what her family has requested. And her family's requested the truth, which we're fighting for, and we will get, and they have requested justice. So I came out publicly at the very beginning of learning of her killing, very strong on several issues. And one was to ban no-knock warrants. And it didn't take long for me to come to that decision, especially after speaking with officers who have served many years on SWAT teams right here in Louisville, Kentucky, who explained to me that the most dangerous moments in an officer's career is a no-knock warrant. And that baffled me. I thought, well, then why in the world would we put our trained law enforcement in a dangerous situation environment if we did not have to? And then officers and citizens made it very clear, on thousands of people have made it very clear that they would like to see our law enforcement have the authority to use a no-knock warrant if it was a serious imminent threat of harm to the law enforcement or civilians. So many people in our community, and we listened to our constituents in our community, and they said, ban the no-knock warrants. However, in response to your question, how did I come around to want to co-sponsor this ordinance along with Councilwoman Green in the beginning and more than 17 of our council members as a result of yesterday's meeting? It is because we listened to the community, and they said, if it's a threat of terrorism, murder, hostage taking, kidnapping, human and sexual trafficking, then we want to be able to give that tool to law enforcement. However, as Councilman Green has clearly, succinctly explained, there are many checks and balances in place. One really important point of Breonna's law that we are discussing and will move into full council for a vote next week, an important component is the transparency and the accountability. So it states clearly that it must be signed. There will be a warrant application form that will be created that will have to be attached to the warrant documents that will have to be signed by our chief of police or their designee and someone of a major's level of rank or above. Because if our chief is out of town and the designee deputy chief is in charge, however, the no-knock warrant would be during a time when a major is on duty and in charge, then that major is considered to have that top rank authority. So we had a lot of discussion about that last night. So it would have to be approved by one of those folks in that line, as well as there must be a second approval pathway, and that will be by the SWAT commanding officer or their immediate supervising officer. And lastly, they can only be executed, a no-knock warrant, and when this passes, by our fully trained SWAT personnel. And that is a key component.
Thank you, Barbara. I'd also like to bring Metro Council President David James. You've been mentioning SWAT. And David, you were a police officer for many years, including being a member of the SWAT team. So I'd like you to, do you see the risks of no-knock and military-style raids for law enforcement as being another reason to eliminate their use, just based on your experience?
I really feel like they should be severely restricted. being on the SWAT team and having rescued hostages before, I think that we use those particular instances in order to save some lives. And I think that you should only use them in order to save human lives.
Sure. So yesterday at the public safety meeting yesterday, Professor Kraska reported that 80% of the no-knock warrants in Louisville were for Black households, when less than 25% of Louisville's population is Black. What can the Metro Council do, or does it plan to do to address this obvious racial disparity in policing?
So, is that to me?
Yeah, that's for you, David.
Okay. I would say that one of the things that we should do is that we should have better leadership of our police department. We just changed police chiefs, and I'm looking forward to what comes next with the police department. There needs to be different training for our police department, inherent bias training for our police department, and there also needs to be a reality check within our police department, a culture change, I guess is the best way to say that. So we're looking for a new chief to bring those changes to our police department, and hopefully that will be the start to that.
Barbara, would you like to jump in? Like, what other changes would you like to see happen to deal with these disparities?
Well, I wish there were an easy pathway for that. And I think it's got to begin with a total education over the last 400 years. We didn't get here overnight. We didn't get where we are with the violence and the killing and police brutality in our nation and our community just in the last year or so. This is a result of the 400 years of racism and institutional oppression that has been used to build America to what it is today. And we've got to face those facts. It was 246 years of slavery, followed by 99 years of Jim Crow, followed by 86 years of lynching. Yes, there were approximately 1,200 white people and more than 3,200 Black people lynched, and then followed by those 14 years of intense civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. And are we any better off today than we were? I would like to spell out many things that are better, but I'm going to have to say I'm not so sure. Louisville, Kentucky is the fourth most segregated city in the United States. That has been shown by research. And right out the window from where I am, 2 blocks from where I live and where I'm sitting right now, is the best example of the worst case of redlining in our country. And it's Roy Wilkins Avenue. I hope people will look that up. We must inform and educate. You know, Blackness is 3 things. It's color, culture, and consciousness. And a white woman like myself is obviously not Black in color or Black in culture, but I must be held accountable to be Black in consciousness. And when I look at my colleagues, Councilwoman Green and President David James, you know, they have Black children. What is it they have to say to their children when their children are very little about how to drive your car, what to do with your hands, how to look for that insurance card? It never occurred to me to have that conversation with my daughter. This is so systemic. And so what has to change? I fully support President David James and the things that he is saying about the training of implicit bias and understanding the deep-rooted racism in our community. And the last thing, it's not just our police. Our police are sworn to protect us, and more than the vast majority get up every day and run into the line of fire to protect us. However, we have housing, food, healthcare, and criminal justice that is the real rooted problem. So I'm hoping we can move the conversation into where the bleeding is, and not just put all this blame on our law enforcement. I think it's a mistake, because that's just where we bleed a little bit. We need a total operation. We need major surgery in the United States of America.
Thank you so much, Barbara, just for your solidarity and for breaking down that history. I'd like to turn back to Radley. Radley, do you feel that Louisville is doing enough? What more needs to be done in this area?
Well, I think the bill sounds great. I think one thing that I have seen in the aftermath of cases like this is a tendency to overlook the damage that can be done by forced entry raids, by thinking that all forced entry raids are no-knocks. And as we saw in Louisville, as I mentioned with that study, the police just sort of lightly knock and announce themselves kind of under their breath and then knock down the door, from the purpose of the people inside, from the purpose of the risk and the threat and the low margin for error in these raids. That's no different than a no-knock raid. Now, I do think that the body cameras will help, because then we'll be able to actually see what they announce and how much time they wait after knocking and announcing. But forced entry is really a big part of the problem. A lot of police departments in other cities have moved to what they call a surround and call out method when it comes to drug warrants. And so they surround the house. Maybe they turn the water off to the house so drugs can't be flushed. And then they get on a bullhorn and they have somebody come out, or they try to catch the person while they're shopping or going out to get their mail, or it's really that breaking down the door in the middle of the night thing that I think puts everybody else at risk. It puts everybody in the house at risk. I mean, in Breonna Taylor's case, 5 police bullets were found in the apartment next door where a pregnant woman lived with a 5-year-old child. That's terrifying. I mean, these tactics put everyone in the house, everybody around, and police officers themselves at risk. And if there are ways to serve drug warrants, I mean, if we have to serve drug warrants, if there are ways to do that don't put people at risk, we need to look into those.
Absolutely. I'd like to bring in a report from the Justice Collaborative Institute with data for progress. We'd like to break down and just see what Americans are thinking about these policies that affect all of our lives. And what we found was 72% of poll respondents believe that no-knock raids should be limited to exceptional cases where the police are investigating a crime that involves the risk of serious physical injury or death. This is a really popular policy shift. Do you think it's going to get across to elected officials outside of Louisville? Jessica? Sorry, you're muted.
I think it's hard getting people to understand, because when you talk about violent crime, that tugs at the heart. But I would encourage people to continue to remember that warrants are about the retrieval of evidence. The execution of warrants is not about saving somebody's life, because if somebody is in extreme danger, if you feel like that somebody is there with a gun up to their head, then the officers have the ability to go into that property. Getting people to understand that when there is such a pressure and a pulling from what seems to be both sides of the equation, the argument from many community activists to push it all the way, and then the legitimate arguments from law enforcement about maintaining safety, it's hard for some people to get there. What I will say is that in Louisville, our Metro Council, we have been a leader on a lot of issues. We are one of the first jurisdictions to have the presumption of body cameras. Most cities are not doing that right now. And so I think that there is a shift in the atmosphere, and not only Black Americans, but white allies at this time. As you look at the protests, they are containing individuals of all races, of all ages. Everybody is understanding that we want people to be safe, and we also want people to be treated with equity. And so I do believe that there's a shift in the atmosphere almost in every city in America, and legislators have to pay attention to the electorate.
Definitely. I feel that transformation is happening. I feel it too. And I really want to thank you guys for joining us. I know this is a really devastating time, but it's also a time that we can really change a lot of these systems fundamentally. And I love, Barbara, when you mentioned that this is not just about police, this is about, mass incarceration and the fact that we dehumanize our people over and over again. So we will look forward to continuing to work with you all. But before we end, tomorrow would have been Breonna's 27th birthday. That's going to be an especially hard day for her family and for your community and for the world. I hope people will say Breonna's name and just lift up her family and lift up Kenneth and his family because he's dealing with that loss too. So again, I want to appreciate all of you. I know you have to get back to doing the work that we do too, but I'd like to also let everybody know to check back in at 1 p.m. Eastern with Representative Rashida Tlaib and Detroit Charter Review Commissioner Denzel McCampbell for another important aspect of this discussion, which is the demilitarization of our police. So we'll be back in a little bit, but again, thank you so much, and be safe out there, and we'll continue to lift up Breonna.
Thank you very much.